Now we're over 50 people. I think that's probably an indication that it's time to get started. So we have a thing to do here that we're really calling a Plenary Plus. It's a compilation of a few special moments in the conference, and we're glad you can all join us for us. The theme that kind of pulls them together is the best work then and now. And we're going to have three parts to this. We're going to have a little look at the curated collections of Jay Forrester, parts 1 and 2, and some of that's going to be by George Richardson, and some of that's going to be by Bob Eberlein. And I was about to call you Robert, and I don't believe I've ever called you Robert.
So that would have been really cool.
A really interesting little twist there. And then we're going to have the presentation of the System Dynamics Application Award and an acceptance presentation of the winning work. It's time now for the presentation of the System Dynamics Society Application Award. So my name is Brad Morrison, and I'm the chair of the selection committee for that award. This award is presented by the Society as often as once a year for the best real-world application of System Dynamics, based primarily on demonstrated measurable benefit through the use of System Dynamics. Instructions for making nominations are on the Society website. I would like to thank the other members of the committee, Jack Homer and Mark Paish, and I'd like to extend a really big thank you to those of you who made nominations. Keep those nominations coming. And to get on with the main business, I am delighted to present the 2020 System Dynamics Application Award to an article in the European Journal of Operations Research entitled Understanding Foodborne Transmission Mechanisms for Norovirus, a study for the UK's Food Standards Agency, whose authors are, in alphabetical order, Abdul Khaled, Darren Holland, Elke Husserman, and David Lane. I will very shortly turn to the paper's first author, David Lane, to present a short talk about the work. I really can't invite him up to the stage, so instead, Alan, would you please promote David to panelist? And in the meantime, I can hear applause coming from all around the world. Yay! The norovirus is more colloquially known as the winter vomiting bug. And I have just lost my script. The winter vomiting bug as a nickname that derives from its seasonality and main symptom. It produces intestinal disease, and those infected experience some mix of nasty intestinal symptoms that I will leave it to you to imagine. In the words of a senior official at the FSA, it is a common and rather unpleasant disease. And the graphic nature of this award presentation, but for some perspective on the relevance of this problem, norovirus is the most common cause of food poisoning in the UK, contributing to an estimated annual burden from foodborne disease of £9 billion. And don't forget, those British pounds are worth 1.3 US dollars each. So globally, it is estimated that there are nearly 750 million cases per year, resulting in 220,000 deaths per year, and what I guess you could say are about 1.5 billion rather unpleasant days. It's also the most commonly identified cause of infectious intestinal disease in the United States and Western Europe. David will share more in his talk in a moment, but just a few notes from me. There are two main transmission mechanisms for the norovirus, person-to-person and foodborne transmission. The FSA, of course, was primarily interested in foodborne transmission. Previous modeling of norovirus had used SEIR models, similar to those we saw in all three papers in our plenary on COVID-19, to represent the person-to-person transmission, but they dealt with foodborne transmission using essentially just an exogenous forcing constant. This study instead developed an endogenous structure detailing the causal mechanisms for foodborne transmission, explicitly representing 4 contamination mechanisms: shellfish, fertilizers, various stages in the supply chain of fruits and vegetables, and human contact during food preparation and consumption. I will highlight 2 of the many really interesting findings. First, they found that the proportion of norovirus cases directly attributable to foodborne mechanisms was about 2.5%, quite a bit smaller than what was previously thought to be around 10%. At first glance, that might suggest that reducing foodborne contamination might have rather limited impact. However, it will come as no surprise to all of you system dynamics out there that in a system like this, with dominant reinforcing loops of contagion, modest and feasible reductions in foodborne transmission yield much greater reductions in overall infection rates because they also slow down person-to-person transmission. Second interesting finding was that while the Food Standards Agency's focus naturally was on the foodborne mechanisms, the magnitude of person-to-person transmissions is far greater, and model exploration showed that small changes in the current conditions characterizing person-to-person transmission would have very powerful effects on the overall trajectory of the seasonal disease. Both of these findings are rooted in the highly nonlinear nature of these dynamics, so we can easily see why an SD model makes these insights so clear. The study made 8 specific and actionable recommendations, the most significant of which rests on this last finding and led to significant impact, namely that the UK needed to take a cross-government approach to intervention. Quoting from a testimonial from the Director of Science at the FSA, a very senior official, this project highlighted the benefit of a cross-government approach to tackling norovirus. Since the report, the FSA has produced a forecasting model for norovirus outbreaks using Twitter data. When an outbreak is forecast, the FSA contacts NHS choices, and together we run joint consumer messaging on hygiene practices covering both food and person-to-person sources. The model helped us drive this collaborative approach. Well, members of the audience, I'll let you choose your favorite metaphor for the difficulty of getting government agencies to work together. Here in Boston, we just say it's wicked hard. So kudos, David et al., for getting that done. Finally, a word on process. A distinctive feature of this EJOR article is their description of what they call the arc of the work. Well worth a read just for this. The paper reveals an assembly of world-class modeling practices. For example, starting with a clear understanding of the purpose of the model and a problem couched in dynamic terms, identifying a reference mode of dynamic behavior and characterizing it with time series data. Partnering skilled and experienced system dynamics modelers, David and Elke, with committed experts in the domain of the focal problem. And by committed, I mean committed to engage in the nitty-gritty of the modeling process. Involving a number of other experts to elucidate the causal mechanisms, and drawing on the best available data to ground their model and parameter estimates. Using previous system dynamics work, namely the SEIR model, as its foundation. Modeling a specific case of a generic class of problems, namely the spread of infectious disease, and carefully customizing the generic model to suit the specific case of interest. Conducting extensive sensitivity analysis, exercising the model to discover important and unexpected model behavior, learning insights that had significant policy implications. And I believe they were able to do so because they let the model speak to them, listening to what it might have to say rather than just trying to generate output they expected. Continuing, intentionally involving the client decision makers throughout the modeling and analysis process. Employing a variety of means to both document and communicate their good work, ranging from a 107-page report fully documenting the model structure, its equations, parameters, and data sources, to more accessible summaries in workshops and presentations, including an international conference on norovirus hosted by the FSA. And finally, being courageous enough to offer recommendations that were unanticipated and indeed a bit contrary to the status quo, that is, to take a cross-government approach. David, Elke, Darren, and Abdul, this is excellent work. And on behalf of the System Dynamics Society, I congratulate you. And I thank you for the contribution to our field by writing it up and publishing it so all can see it. I'd like to invite you to tell us a little bit more about it. So let's hear now from David.
Thank you again to Brad. Thank you to the committee for this award. Thank you also to the committee and to all other system dynamicists from whom we've learnt so much. over the years. This was a modelling project done with the FSA. We'll describe it in these 4 sections. Let's start off by setting the scene. Norovirus is a virus, segments of RNA inside a protein coat or capsid. It produces infectious intestinal disease. If you're exposed to it, you are latent for about 2 days, and then most humans experience nausea, vomiting and diarrhea. People are highly infectious then, and most recover in about 48 hours. You might have heard about cruise ship outbreaks. It also has a strongly seasonal pattern, which is why it's also known as the winter vomiting bug. This is real UK data. The main vector for norovirus is person-to-person contact, P2P, but that's not the whole story. It can also be transmitted via a number of food-related mechanisms. Norovirus is the most commonly identified cause of infectious intestinal disease and acute gastroenteritis in the United States of America and in Western Europe. There are 3 million cases per year in the UK, which means 6 million pretty horrible days. The client was the Food Standards Agency, part of the UK government responsible for protecting public health in relation to food, so the growing, handling, packing, labelling and preparing of food. The project aims were these: to develop a simulation model because that would improve understanding of the food-borne mechanisms, the focus of the work. It would tell us how important food-borne transmission is and tell us where the FSA should concentrate its efforts. The problem was that at the start the FSA said that we wouldn't be able to do that because they didn't have the parameters, but we decided to give it a go anyway. So part 1 of the study looked like this. The existing work used these equations. These are a variant of a standard SEIR model, almost 100 years old, still useful. It's actually at the heart of COVID-19 modelling today. It was a previous FSA study that we built on, but there were 2 issues with the work by Lawrence et al. First of all, it wasn't correctly calibrated, and secondly it concentrated on the P2P effects. So it had a beta infection as a result of standard mixing between susceptibles and infectives, and a theta, which is an exogenous term representing foodborne effects. We rebuilt this in SD software, and here you can see we have susceptibles who are exposed to infectives and to foodborne sources of norovirus. Then the exposed class, they have norovirus, and after 2 days they become infectious, either symptomatic or asymptomatic. After 2 days they become recovered immune, where they stay for an average of 6 months. There are also births and deaths. Our task was based on what experts currently knew about foodborne infection routes to turn theta, a number, into a whole set of causal mechanisms. The process that we used was iterative modelling. There was a literature review. We did expert interviews where we introduced people to stock flow diagram symbols, further literature reviews, further interviews, the beginning of modelling, and finally a workshop that brought it all together, and these are images from that final meeting. But throughout, the FSA arranged access to staff drawn from a range of agencies: the Animal Health and Veterinary Laboratories Agency, the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science, the Food and Environment Research Agency, the Health Protection Agency, and FSA staff themselves. We built their model of the 4 main contamination mechanisms, which I will just outline. So, first of all, bivalve shellfish. Norovirus genomes are excreted by infectious humans, pass into sewage, which is treated and then discharged into the ocean. The genomes are absorbed by bivalve shellfish, such as oysters, and humans eat the shellfish, often uncooked. And then sludge, fertilizer applied to soil. Norovirus genomes in treated sewage passed into sludge. Some of the soil sticks to crops. The important ones are berry fruits and leafy vegetables, BF and LV, strawberries, lettuce, food that is not cooked, and these are consumed by humans. Then the BF and LV supply chain, which had 3 stages: harvesting, norovirus contamination from sludge or infected pickers; processing, contamination from infected food processing workers; and use, so that's social catering and home preparation, from infected preparers. Finally, other foodstuffs, other foods, can be contaminated if prepared by infected people. This is true for home or catering, so restaurants, staff canteens. Now, all those sectors fold back into the people sector. The exogenous theta is gone, replaced by infection rates caused by the various foodborne mechanisms. So we have this huge thing, right? But what use is this model of the now endogenized causal mechanisms? Well, first off, it exists. It shows that it's possible to build it. Secondly, it shows that we know enough about the foodborne mechanisms to create a good model that specialists in the area recognise, understand and accept, a model that is explicit, well documented and understandable. So it's useful for all of these reasons. Now, conceptualization was complete, formulation was complete, all the equations were written, all of the parameters made conceptual sense, but there were a lot of parameters, all meaningful and measurable in principle, but as the FSA warned us from the start, we do not have all the parameters, so we couldn't simulate. But the model is still useful for one more thing. Exactly because of all of the detailed and careful conceptualization, the formulation, the dimension checking, we were able to think about the parameters and contribute to the norovirus research agenda. We asked 2 questions. Do we know the parameter, or do we need more research? And is the parameter fixed by nature, or could human behavior alter it? So you get a nice 2x2 matrix. And we went through the model and categorized all of the parameters into one of these 4 boxes. And that helped the FSA think about, 1, what it wanted to find out with future research, and 2, where policy parameters might be. And it's important to say that it was actually a workshop participant who suggested that the model was useful for this, which we took as an indicator of model ownership. Now, the FSA were very happy at this point, and we could have stopped. In fact, we then had an idea that there was more modelling that we could do, and that created a whole second half to the project, and it helped us scope how important foodborne effects actually are. Here's how we did it. We went back to the Lawrence et al. P2P work. We made some small extensions to that model, and we got data from a new paper. A new annual incidence rate, a new estimate of how much of that was foodborne, and also a new estimate for how many people have norovirus but have no symptoms. Then there were 2 steps. This is the first, calibrating that new but compact model. We realized that you can calculate things using steady state analysis and horrible algebra. That doesn't matter. If you do that, it's possible to calibrate the extended P2P model. You take the world as is, with the new data processed by the assumptions in the model, and consistent with that you get the prevalence of norovirus, how many people are in each stock, and the beta and theta values that exist in the world right now. And this was, we think, the first empirically calibrated model of norovirus. But you can do even more and explore scenarios. This needs even more horrible algebra, and this reminded me of the words of Jim Murray, my old doctoral supervisor in Oxford, who would say, this is just tedious algebra. If you work through the tedious algebra, you can explore scenarios. You go into what-if world. You assume beta and theta. You process that through the model's assumptions, and you get a sense of how incidence and prevalence depend on different betas and different thetas. In other words, on P2P versus foodborne mechanisms. Here is how incidence changes with that foodborne parameter theta. This is the base case of 2.9 million cases, most resulting from person-to-person infection, the red line. If theta is doubled, norovirus increases by a third. So the right-hand side there is what we've gained from current rules on food handling. If theta drops to 0, norovirus is reduced by 75%. So that's what we could gain if we reduced theta. So the FSA are quite right to look into reducing foodborne transmission effects. But from where we are now, that curve is quite flat. Compare that with changes in the person-to-person infectivity. Here's the 2.9 million again. If beta is doubled, norovirus increases by 14 times. So the right-hand side shows what we've already gained from getting people to wash and dry their hands after going to the toilet, after being around sick people and small children, etc. If beta goes to 0, norovirus is reduced by 97.5%. So that's what we could gain if we improve personal hygiene even more. But even from where we are now, this curve is very nonlinear. If you increase it by 10%, you triple the norovirus incidence. If you decrease it by 25%, it collapses to 10% of its current value. And that's a huge reduction in work lost and misery and even morbidity. And you can simulate the model to see this sensitivity, of course. Here's the base case of 2.9 million. Here's a 1% reduction in beta, a 10% reduction in beta, a 25% reduction in beta. For completeness, you can take beta to 0 or increase it by 1%, and you see the nonlinearity. And this really just confirms the steady state calculation. But it also gives you the response time of the system, which is about 1 to 2 years. Now, what does this sensitivity give us? Well, two insights. At the start, I said there was strong seasonal variation. Here's 3 years actual data. If you set the average of this to 1, you can extract a seasonal trend, and you find that it's a factor of 10 between peak and trough. And a factor of 10 is hard to explain. But now, knowing how sensitive incidence is to beta, you can ask the question, what seasonal pattern in beta would produce that outcome of incidence? Algebra gives you this. You just need beta to go up by 6% or drop down to 86% of its base value. Put that seasonal pattern for beta into the extended and recalibrated P2P model, add a little pink noise, simulate, and the compact model reproduces the observed behavior. So norovirus incidence may change by an order of magnitude across a year, but in human behavior terms, you only need 106% peak and 86% trough, and that's much more plausible and easier to explain. There's a second insight. Now return to the fact that theta and beta have very different sensitivities. This really shows up when you put the two on the same graph. Look at the difference in marginal gains. Of course, this horizontal axis is parameter change, it's not money and it's not effort, so it's not the whole story about what you'd have to do to get this, but it makes a challenging point to the Food Standards Agency. This shows that the scope of the foodborne effects is small with respect to the person-to-person effects. I'll come back to that in a moment. Let me end with a summary of findings and implications of the work, because these relate very well to the aims of the project. So, first off, modelling foodborne mechanisms is possible. Modelling is useful. Workshop participants stated that it was useful for understanding pathways of infection, filling knowledge gaps, framing further research requirements. The problem is the modelling is parameter hungry. But a compact model can still give insight into sensitivities. The final report was internally reviewed by anonymous FSA experts, and one of them wrote, "The modelling work identified important sensitivities, nonlinear effects and parameter uncertainties." End quote. So, for example, into seasonality, we showed that modelling offers a partial explanation for the seasonal pattern. And a compact model can act as an organising or prioritising framework for discussions on interventions. The modelling suggests that we are at a point where the best gains are got maybe not from foodborne effects, but from improving person-to-person hygiene. But remember, foodborne effects are what the FSA are supposed to be interested in. Improved toilet facilities for fruit pickers, guidelines for shellfish safety, etc. That is the broader point. Maybe tackling norovirus is about getting more of these in place. Food may not be where the action is, and this is what we said in the final report, and the anonymous reviewers certainly got this. Quote, intervention in person-to-person virus transmission and associated public health policies, whilst falling outside the FSA's remit, could be as important as foodborne vectors. End quote. And that's a challenging thing to say. Sound system dynamics modelling is what you need to be able to say it and to be listened to. And we did both. And you can see that from the mix of names on the paper that we published and the people receiving this award. Thank you very much again.
Well, congratulations again, David. I will offer you the opportunity to say hello. And I see there's at least one question in the Q&A.
Yes, I saw it.
Lob at you.
I saw it.
Okay.
Yeah, well, so just to say live, I'm sorry you've just got me for various reasons. You just have me. I knew I couldn't beat you on the beard front, and that's reinforced by seeing George now. So I just thought I'd put on a tie and make an effort there. But thank you. We are very grateful. One of the pleasures of working with the Food Standards Agency is their link with various scientists. They're very, very serious on their science, and they were really delighted to receive this award. They take it very seriously to get an award from a learned society. So thank you on their behalf. Thank you also from us. The question, oh gosh, there are now more. Let me have a look at them. What surprised the client/stakeholders the most about the model and method? That it was possible. Actually, some very system dynamic stuff that these people who were highly expert in their particular area were able to come together and discuss mechanisms in what they thought were different areas, but had a sense were all to do with norovirus. They were sat there in a room which was kind of wallpapered with stock flow diagrams, and they were able to talk about things, and we had them actually crossing out bits of the stock flow diagram on the wall and putting it right, and also doing some live stuff. I think they were surprised that we were able to elicit their knowledge, articulate it in diagrams, and share it with them. And we kind of know this stuff is possible, but you always cross your fingers when you start one of these, don't you? But they were surprised, and it was just a joy to work with them, because these people just knew everything about their area. They were just incredibly impressive people to work with. But still, system dynamics, was able to bring something that they really hadn't anticipated and that they really liked. They really enjoyed it. That was not a hard session. I remember we worried about it enormously. On the day, it was not a difficult session. It was exhausting. I went to the theatre that evening and fell asleep. But it was not difficult because they bought into the process, and they could see immediately they were getting something from it.
David, do you want to my help to see what's in the Q&A, or do you want to read it yourself?
Yeah, let me.
Okay.
Right. Well, Brad mentioned one of the recommendations. I mean, I think there's a kind of different levels of the recommendations. I mean, the big one is kind of, the FSA may not be where the action is. I went to this international conference in London, which brought in a whole load of people who specialize in norovirus. And one of the speakers came in the afternoon and said how utterly frustrated he was that he'd just come out of the gents' toilet and he'd been able to put his hand under an automatic tap, which was good, but then found out that the water was boiling hot, and that this was stupid to have a piece of engineering that almost solved the problem, right, and yet didn't. And so I think that kind of shift, of going, there's lots of very, very basic things, that we can be doing here, and all of this seems to play very, very strongly into the things that we're all getting used to now with COVID-19. So that shift of organizational kind of focus, I guess, would be the macro thing which you highlighted. It was fun to do, by the way. That's the other thing. System dynamics is fun. Yeah. Right. Well, what else?
Erling asked if you have any information about neurovirus in the time of COVID-19. Has it declined in any way?
Well, I haven't got recent data. That very, very long data stream I got was from Public Health England. I think Public Health England are a bit busy at the moment, doing test and trace. Indeed, I hope that's what they're doing. I would imagine it's gone down because social mixing has gone down. But of course, actually, no, I can't say that. I can't walk into a nonlinear system and predict that, can I? Because I don't know what's happening on the food front. I imagine people are not going out on Valentine's Day and having oysters too much. There's always a peak on the 14th of February of norovirus. I didn't mention that. So there's less of that. People may be cooking more food, but we're now entering to the summer, so we may be getting more berry fruits and leafy vegetables, which is where a lot of this stuff comes from. But it's quite a subtle thing, this, because although cooking knocks this out, they had a case in a restaurant which they managed to track down to tomato soup, which didn't make any sense at all because tomato soup is warm, right? And they looked into it and they found out that one of the chefs was sprinkling basil on the tomato soup, and the chef had norovirus. So it's a subtle business. I'm not really answering Erling's question because I don't know the answer.
Okay.
How did I convince the FSA? No, on this one I have to be honest. They didn't come to us. They put out a call for a piece of system dynamics modeling, and indeed they asked for it to be in Vensim. We wrote a proposal in and got it. There is quite a bit of familiarity with system dynamics in the UK operational research community, right? For about 30 years now, system dynamics and operational research has been talking to each other quite well. And in government, the Government Operational Research Service has got some system dynamicists in it. I know them, I train some of them. And so we've got a decent reputation there. I do a lot of government work myself, maybe that's part of it too. So the call was there. Then it was a question of just trying to do a good job.
David John Sturman posted in the chat that the CDC data shows that norovirus incidence is way down during the COVID era, and
okay.
for exactly the reasons that you talked about.
Okay.
Not sure if that was U.S. data or globally. But, okay, we're coming to the end of our time. So, any parting thoughts from Bob or George?
Just congratulations to David. Fabulous work.
That really is good work. It's very pleasing to see.
Thank you, George. I appreciate that greatly. And thank you, Bob, likewise. Thank you from all four of us.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
For all showing up, and thank you for your rousing applause for this absolutely fabulous work. Really nice. Appreciate it. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the conference.
Right. Thank you very much again. Right.